World leaders will face a reckoning over humanity's failure to curb climate-heating emissions and polluting fossil fuels when they meet for UN climate talks next week. Pope Francis, King Charles III, political leaders, activists and lobbyists will be among the more than 70,000 visitors expected for the COP28 meeting in the United Arab Emirates, making it the largest UN climate change conference ever held. Negotiators will grapple with a host of flashpoint issues, including the future of oil, gas and coal, as well as financial solidarity between rich polluters and poorer nations most vulnerable to accelerating climate impacts. But the central focus will be a damning stock-taking of the world's limited progress on curbing global warming, which requires an official response to be crafted at the November 30 to December 12 talks. To take a look at COP conferences, we're joined by Phillip, Jakpor, our climate activist. Good to have you on the news. To what extent did the discussions and negotiations during the COP27 address the pressing requirement for climate action and the combat against climate change effectively?
First of all, I want to thank you for having me on your program. To speak to the issue, COP27, which held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, was a convergence that most African delegates that attended, civil society, looked forward to participating in because it was a COP that held on the African continent. So there was a lot of hope, there was a lot of expectations. Now, I will say it was a mixed bag of outcomes. On the success side of things, one of the most crucial issues that climate activists and developing countries have been advocating for, which was the loss and damage fund, was actually, it was set up at COP27 in Egypt. Now, the loss and damage fund is expected to address some of the irreversible impacts of climate change, such as extreme drought, the forest fires. We have, communities on the coastlines of Africa that are suffering massive sea level incursion. So the loss and damage fund is supposed to address those kind of issues. And on the positive side, it was, the fund was set up in COP27. And of course, at COP27, there was the expansion of what we call the adaptation fund. Now, there's the discussion about mitigation, and there's also the discussion about adaptation. Now, most countries on the front lines of the climate crisis are pushing for adaptation funds because mitigation is only after the crisis, but adaptation is how we can continue to cope with this crisis, which we are not responsible for. So there was an expansion in the fund. I think it's about $850 million now. There were about $250 million of pledges at COP27. So those, for instance, were positives. But on the negative side,
could you just take a sorry to interrupt you, Philip. Let's just take a quick break. Hold your thoughts. We'll come back and get most of it. Please stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. We're still talking with Phillip Jakpor, a climate activist, as we prepare for the COP28 climate conference. Just before we went on that very brief break, you talked about some of the positives from COP27, and you're just going to tell us some of the negative of it. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. So on the negative side, the $100 billion a year promised, of course, starting from when the Paris Agreement was reached. Again, we have not been able to meet those targets. We are falling far behind. And of course, who are those responsible for this? Is the same developed nations, the countries of the global north, the United States, China, Russia, countries that are on the front lines of the pollution that we have globally, what has caused climate change. Added to that was the fact that there was no strong language on organizations like the World Bank and IFIs that actually fund dirty energy projects, and many of which you have on the continent. And most importantly was the disappointing language that came out from the COP27 on the advocacy for a phase out of coal, and any other dirty energy project. What we heard at the end was a phase down, not phase out, which is what developing nations and nations on the front lines of the climate crisis actually advocated. So, like I said earlier, COP27 was a mixed bag of good and positives and negatives.
All right, there's this, I had this conversation on a program here, One Slot, a few days ago, and it's about the East Africa oil crude pipeline construction that is causing a lot of controversy. As we head for the COP28, what kinds of, we're talking about phasing out fossil fuel. What kind of conversation do you expect to see regarding this humongous project that's been embarked upon, and how it will impact not only the East African region, but Africa generally?
Well, the East African crude oil pipeline, to start with, is a project that has disrupted the lives and livelihoods of a lot of communities in Uganda, particularly. I've been to some of those communities, and I can testify that the impacts are very, very grave. And of course, you have companies like Total behind such a project at a time that we should be looking at renewables. Now, what you see happening with the hiccup in Uganda and around that axis, and the discussions around even the Trans-Saharan pipeline, it shows the hypocrisy of the Western world, which has been advocating, transition to just energy, but because of the Russia-Ukraine war and the fact that Russia cut off gas to Europe, there's now massive investments in Africa to draw oil and gas to Europe. But then at COP28, which is starting in a few days' time, what we expect, especially African delegates, to be advocating is the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. That is very, very important. And the need for high-income countries, the United States, China, to do more. This is not the time to talk all those big, highfalutin language and do nothing. They should do more. And then, of course, those countries that have made pledges in terms of commitments to, addressing the climate crisis, which we face more.
So basically, they should go beyond the lip service and concretize on actions that needs to be taken to truly address climate change. Philip, thank you so much for speaking with us. I hope we can have this conversation another time.
Thank you very much.